January the 17th, 1942, Pearl Harbor Naval Base, Oahu. The morning sun climbs over the Pacific horizon, casting golden light across water still stained with oil from sunken battleships. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stands on the deck of the battleship Nagato, anchored in Hiroshima Bay, thousands of miles away, staring at intelligence photographs spread before him like tarot cards predicting an unavoidable fate. The images show something his staff officers struggle to comprehend: American aircraft carriers moving in formation, their flight decks launching and recovering aircraft with mechanical precision that defies everything Japan's naval doctrine assumed about a wounded enemy. In his hand, he holds a telegram from Commander Minoru Genda, his air operations mastermind, recently returned from analyzing captured American naval documents. The paper trembles slightly, not from the winter wind, from what the words represent. Yamamoto does not weep yet, that will come later. But in this crystalline moment, with salt air filling his lungs and the weight of empire pressing on his shoulders, he understands something his colleagues in Tokyo refuse to acknowledge. Japan has not merely awakened a sleeping giant. They have provoked a nation that builds weapons the way other countries build houses, quickly, efficiently, and in numbers that mock human comprehension. 6 weeks earlier, Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor had seemed a tactical masterpiece. 8 American battleships destroyed or damaged, nearly 200 aircraft obliterated on the ground, over 2,000 Americans dead in a single morning. Japanese carriers had struck with the coordinated fury of a swordmaster, 6 flight decks launching strike waves that moved like synchronized shoals of steelfish. In Tokyo, admirals celebrated. In Berlin, Hitler rejoiced at this new ally's audacity. The Imperial Japanese Navy had demonstrated what modern carrier warfare could achieve when executed with perfection, discipline, and samurai spirit. But Yamamoto, who had studied at Harvard and served as naval attaché in Washington, knew what his celebrating colleagues did not. They had struck aluminum and steel, not industrial capacity. The American carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, Saratoga, had been at sea during the attack, untouched, prowling somewhere in the vast Pacific like predators temporarily displaced from their hunting grounds. And America's shipyards, those vast cathedral spaces of rivets and welding torches stretching along both coasts, remained 3,000 miles beyond the reach of Japanese bombs. The Imperial Navy had trained for this war for decades. Their carrier pilots were the finest in the world, averaging over 800 flight hours before joining operational squadrons. Their mechanics could strip and rebuild a Nakajima engine blindfolded. Their tactical coordination had been honed through endless exercises in which carriers operated as independent striking forces, occasionally working in pairs, but never in the massive concentrated formations that American intelligence reports now described. This was the Japanese way: excellence through individual mastery, spiritual discipline compensating for material limitations. What Yamamoto's intelligence officers brought him in January 1942 shattered that comfortable doctrine like porcelain dropped on stone. The Americans were not rebuilding slowly, carefully, in the methodical manner of a defeated power licking its wounds. They were erupting. In San Diego, Mare Island, Bremerton, and Norfolk, construction scaffolding rose around new carrier hulls like steel forests growing at time-lapse speed. The Essex-class carriers, ships displacing over 27,000 tons, larger than anything Japan had on the drawing boards, were being laid down in multiples, not 1, not 2, dozens. The Americans had apparently looked at their peacetime carrier force of 7 ships and decided that number was insufficient by a factor of 10. But mere numbers, Tokyo argued, meant nothing without skill. Japanese pilots were warriors, American pilots were factory workers with flight training. This was what the Bushido-educated staff officers believed, what they needed to believe. The reports from Commander Genda, however, painted a different picture, one that made Yamamoto's sleep increasingly troubled. American carriers were not operating as individual ships. They were moving in task forces of 3, sometimes 4, carriers, surrounded by protective rings of cruisers and destroyers, the entire formation maneuvering as a single organism. Their fighter combat air patrols maintained altitude discipline. Their scout planes covered search sectors with geometric precision. And their coordination, the terrifying mechanical coordination, allowed them to launch strike packages of 70, 80, 100 aircraft simultaneously from multiple decks, overwhelming any defense through sheer concentration of force. Japan's doctrine had assumed carrier battles would be elegant duels, one carrier group finding another, launching a strike wave, engaging in a contest of skill and timing. The Americans were preparing for something else entirely, industrial-scale air warfare in which coordination mattered more than individual brilliance, in which radar and radio transformed separate ships into a unified weapon system, in which mass and synchronization crushed Bushido the way a steam press crushes silk. Yamamoto requested a demonstration. In March 1942, Japanese carriers Akagi and Kaga attempted an exercise, both ships launching a coordinated strike of 50 aircraft against a simulated target. The results humiliated the Imperial Navy's finest. Timing failures, radio miscommunication, aircraft from different carriers arriving at the rendezvous point minutes apart, destroying the element of synchronized attack. Mechanics scrambled to ready planes quickly enough to match the theoretical launch rates. Pilots grew frustrated with unfamiliar coordination requirements. The exercise was repeated, marginally better, still far from the seamless orchestration American task forces apparently achieved routinely. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of Japan's carrier striking force, dismissed the failures as peacetime jitters. His pilots, he insisted, would perform magnificently when real combat beckoned. Yamamoto said nothing, but that night he penned a letter to an old friend, never sent, found decades later in his papers. "We have lit a flame that we do not know how to extinguish. The Americans build carriers the way we build bicycles. They coordinate fleets the way we coordinate squads. This is not a war of courage, it is a war of production lines." The symbolic object that haunted Japanese naval planning was not a weapon, but a photograph, an aerial reconnaissance image taken by a Japanese submarine near Hawaii in February 1942. It showed 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Yorktown, and Lexington, steaming in formation, their massive flight decks visible as grey rectangles against blue ocean. Around them, destroyer screens formed concentric protective arcs. The precision was mathematical, the spacing exact. And above the formation, barely visible as dots, circled combat air patrol fighters maintaining altitude watches at 1,000-foot intervals. The photograph represented industrial warfare translated into naval doctrine, standardization, mass production, synchronized operation. Everything samurai tradition had not prepared Japan's warriors to confront. That photograph circulated among Japanese naval command like contraband scripture, glimpsed but not discussed openly. To acknowledge what it represented meant acknowledging that Japan's entire naval philosophy, built on elite warriors achieving impossible feats through spiritual superiority, faced an opponent that simply ignored such cultural assumptions. The Americans were not trying to produce better individual pilots. They were building a system that made individual brilliance tactically irrelevant. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 provided the first test. American carriers Lexington and Yorktown faced Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku in history's first carrier versus carrier battle fought entirely by aircraft, with the opposing ships never seeing each other. The Japanese sank Lexington and damaged Yorktown. Tokyo celebrated a tactical victory. But Japanese commanders returned troubled. American strike coordination had been devastating, waves of dive bombers and torpedo planes arriving simultaneously from multiple directions, forcing Japanese ships to maneuver frantically, unable to concentrate anti-aircraft fire effectively. Japanese pilots reported American formations maintaining cohesion under fire, something no amount of individual courage could replicate without radio discipline and standardized tactics. More disturbing, the Americans had demonstrated they could rapidly replace losses. Yorktown, damaged enough that Japanese intelligence estimated 3 months repair time, appeared at Midway just 4 weeks later, patched together by American shipyard workers laboring 72 hours straight. Japanese carriers damaged in Coral Sea took months to repair fully, not because Japanese shipwrights lacked skill, but because Japan's industrial base lacked depth. One dry dock became a bottleneck. One specialized part required weeks to manufacture. The Americans had backup facilities for their backup facilities. Midway arrived like fate's hammer in June 1942. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, faced 3 American carriers. Japan's finest carrier-striking force, the same ships and many of the same pilots that had devastated Pearl Harbor, sailed confidently toward what they assumed would be another demonstration of Japanese superiority. Yamamoto, commanding from a battleship hundreds of miles behind the carrier force, felt gnawing unease but had no tactical authority to override Nagumo's battle decisions. The battle unfolded as nightmare. American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arriving by coincidence or divine intervention in a perfectly timed strike, exactly the kind of coordinated attack Japanese doctrine thought impossible for American pilots, caught Japanese carriers with aircraft being rearmed on their flight decks. In 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers transformed into floating infernos. Hiryu struck back, crippling Yorktown, but was herself destroyed hours later. By battle's end, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers and hundreds of irreplaceable veteran pilots. The Americans lost 1 carrier and began building its replacement before the wreckage settled on the ocean floor. In Tokyo, when the casualty reports arrived, junior officers spoke of honor and sacrifice, senior admirals maintained stern faces, but Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, who had helped plan the Pearl Harbor attack, was found by an aide in a conference room at night, staring at a map of the Pacific, tears streaming silently down his weathered face. He said nothing. The aide withdrew. Such grief could not be acknowledged officially, but it could no longer be denied privately. What broke the spirit of Japan's naval leadership was not the defeat itself. Samurai culture had frameworks for understanding honorable loss, but the pace of American recovery. By late 1942, American shipyards delivered the first Essex-class carriers. By 1943, they arrived monthly. The Americans were simultaneously building smaller escort carriers by the dozens, constructing them on merchant ship hulls the way Japan built fishing boats. Task Force 38, the American fast carrier force, eventually operated 15 fleet carriers simultaneously, a number that exceeded Japan's total carrier construction for the entire war. Japanese admirals studied intelligence reports with the incomprehension of medieval knights trying to understand machine guns. How could a single nation build warships faster than Japan could train pilots to fly from them? How could American industrial capacity be so vast that losing a carrier was merely an accounting inconvenience? The spiritual calculations that had sustained Japanese strategy, Bushido compensating for material disadvantage, courage balancing industrial disparity, collapsed under the weight of simple arithmetic. You could not outcourage a dozen aircraft carriers. You could not spiritually overcome 200 aircraft launched simultaneously from multiple decks, guided by radar, coordinated by radio, delivered by pilots who might lack Japanese veterans' skill, but arrived in numbers that made skill a secondary consideration. Admiral Ugaki Matome, Yamamoto's chief of staff, kept a diary throughout the war. His entry from November 1943 reads like an epitaph. We face not an enemy, but a phenomenon. Their carriers breed like insects, their aircraft darken the sky like locusts. We kill 10 and 20, replace them. We sink one ship and 3 emerge from their shipyards. This is not war as we understood it. This is industry weaponized. How does one defeat industry with courage? The symbolic weight of American carrier coordination extended beyond tactical effectiveness into psychological warfare. Japanese pilots returning from strikes against American task forces reported formations that seemed to anticipate every maneuver, combat air patrols that appeared overhead within minutes of Japanese aircraft being detected, anti-aircraft barrages so dense they resembled physical walls of steel. This was not luck, it was systems integration, radar providing early warning, fighter directors vectoring interceptors using radio, standardized defensive doctrine allowing ships to maneuver without conflicting with each other. The Americans had transformed naval warfare from an art to an engineering problem, then solved it with the same industrial mindset that built their highways and skyscrapers. For Japanese commanders raised on stories of samurai warriors whose spiritual purity allowed them to defeat numerically superior foes, this American approach seemed almost blasphemous. War was supposed to be about honor, discipline, the transcendent power of the human spirit. The Americans treated it as a logistics puzzle. They did not train warriors, they trained operators. They did not forge swords. They stamped out identical aircraft on assembly lines, and they won, endlessly, mechanically, inevitably, they won. By 1944, Japanese carriers rarely ventured from port, not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked aircraft, pilots, and fuel to operate them. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot in June 1944 saw Japanese carrier aircraft slaughtered wholesale by American fighters, hundreds of Japanese planes destroyed for minimal American losses. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding Japanese carriers, watched the massacre through binoculars and reportedly turned to his staff with empty eyes. The Americans do not fight battles, they conduct exterminations. Admiral Yamamoto did not live to see Japan's final carrier humiliations. American codebreakers intercepted his travel plans in April 1943. P-38 fighters ambushed his transport aircraft over Bougainville. He died as he had lived, understanding too clearly what his nation refused to accept. But before his death, he had witnessed enough to understand the war's ultimate trajectory. In his final months, he wrote extensively, though most writings were destroyed. One fragment survived. I have seen the American carriers coordinate. It is not seamanship, it is orchestration. They have made warfare industrial, and industry always defeats artistry in sustained conflict. We have crafted a sword. They have built a factory that produces 10,000 swords daily. How does craftsmanship prevail against such abundance? The tears shed by Japanese admirals were not for ships lost or battles defeated. They were for the death of a world view. Japan had entered the war believing spirit could overcome material, that the samurai virtues of discipline and courage could defeat a soft, decadent democracy obsessed with comfort and wealth. The American carrier task forces demonstrated the opposite, that democracy's strength lay precisely in its industrial abundance, that coordination mattered more than individual excellence, that a nation built on mass production and standardization could project those same virtues into warfare with devastating effect. The photograph of 3 American carriers sailing in perfect formation became, for thoughtful Japanese officers, a symbol of modernity itself. Impersonal, efficient, unstoppable. Not 3 ships, but a vision of the future. One in which wars were won not by heroes but by systems, not by swords but by assembly lines, not by individual warriors achieving transcendence, but by masses of adequately trained operators coordinated through technology. In the end, Japan built 17 aircraft carriers during the war. America launched 141. Japanese carriers operated increasingly alone, isolated, starved of fuel and aircraft. American carriers roamed the Pacific in clusters of 4, 6, 8 at a time, their decks launching strike packages that blackened the sky, their coordination so seamless that Japanese survivors described them not as separate ships, but as a single, vast, mechanical creature with multiple heads and one merciless mind. The weeping came quietly in private moments, when proud men raised on centuries of samurai tradition confronted a truth their culture had no framework to process: that they had challenged not merely another nation, but another way of organizing human effort, and that their elegant warrior tradition had shattered against the mass-produced efficiency of industrial democracy. The Americans had not merely built more carriers. They had revealed that modern war belonged to whoever could best translate factory logic into naval doctrine, and no amount of courage or spiritual discipline could overcome that fundamental transformation. The carriers sailed on, white wakes spreading behind them like America itself, vast, multiplying, coordinating, with machine precision, unstoppable as the future.